that was the case. The final agreement had come out at about 1:30 that day, that Saturday, December 12th, and we were supposed to convene in plenary at 5:30, hopefully to adopt the agreement. And it turned out, well, we were waiting, and they hadn't started at 6 o'clock, and that's typical. Things tend to start late, but then we noticed that the dais up front, where you needed all the main players to be there to start the meeting, was now empty, and they were sort of running around, and there were people milling around on the floor, and some of the really big heavy hitters were huddling and talking very seriously to one another, and then the Twitter sphere erupted that it was Article 4.4 that was the problem, and there was a shall, and it should have been a should. And in international law, shall means legally binding, and should means not. And so it could have broken down the talks. This is a paragraph on developed countries having economy-wide emission reduction targets, and it would have meant the U.S., whether or not the U.S. could join the agreement. The French presidency, again, handled that with skill, and they ended up just reading it off as a technical error, and the agreement was adopted before we knew what happened. But can I say a couple words on the outcome? So it's been billed as universal, which is an interesting way to look at it, because the UNFCCC is an example of what we would normally think of an agreement with universal participation, and that's because we have nearly every country in the world as a party, whereas the Paris Agreement doesn't have any parties yet. It's not even open for signature yet, and we'll need 55 countries to ratify it, and they'll need to represent at least 55% of global emissions for it to come into force. But when people say universal, they're comparing it to the Kyoto Protocol and to some extent the Cancun agreements, where there was still that distinct difference between Annex 1, or developed countries, and non-Annex 1 countries, which are developing countries. And those annexes are not in the agreement. They're not mentioned anymore. And the U.S. and others really worked to change that paradigm so that every country would have to have a contribution under the new agreement. And because we do have 188 intended nationally determined contributions already, I am confident that we will hit the ratifications and the percentage of emissions needed for it to come into force. But it's definitely an evolution in climate governance to expect developed countries to do, or developing countries to do more. And then these contributions will be ratcheted up every 5 years, and there will be a global stock take to assess progress. And the contributions cannot sort of backtrack. They have to always be a progression over the last one. And those are that's kind of like one of the main parts of the agreement. The other big points are that the long-term goal includes both the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, and parties also will pursue efforts to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And parties intend to peak emissions as soon as possible, and they hope to reach net zero emissions in the second half of this century. And I'll leave it there because I think I'm out of time.
Great, thank you, Virginia. I'm going to test how the mic works at different positions here to see how much feedback we get. Okay, so our next panelist is Jill Stein, who is an organizer, physician, and environmental health activist. She has led initiatives promoting healthy communities, local green economies, and the revitalization of democracy, addressing issues such as environmental, economic, and racial justice, campaign finance reform, green jobs, and the cleanup of incinerators, coal plants, and toxic substances. She was a principal organizer for the Global Climate Convergence for People, Planet, and Peace Over Profit. Previously, she served on the Massachusetts and National Boards of Directors for Physicians for Social Responsibility, where she worked on environmental health and nuclear disarmament.
Okay. Yeah, how's that? All right, great. We'll give this a try. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to the organizer. Thank you to the Peace House for hosting us here. And thank you, Virginia, for that very wonderful I guess, sort of official view of the conference. I have a very unofficial view of the conference. I was there as an insurgent, a presidential candidate with a very different point of view. And, you know, I'll say that I was outside of the official conference. I actually did have observer status, but I didn't wind up using it. And I was out in the People's Climate Summit and at an event, a forum that I was able to do jointly with the Deputy Chief Negotiator from China and with many indigenous members of indigenous tribes from the Northwest. And it was this very interesting mix of China, U.S. Progressive viewpoint, and indigenous tribes. And at the Climate Summit, I'll just say, I wound up doing several workshops on the on climate and militarism and climate and war. And it felt really good to be doing that because the summit and the COP, in my experience, was not only about the climate crisis, it was also about the war crisis, because the war had come to Paris in the form of the terrorist blowback that had just happened. So it was very much on people's minds. And the crisis in democracy was also very much on people's minds, especially the climate justice movement, which was precluded from having its demonstrations and its gatherings. So it was like the voice of people was being silenced, but the voice of industry that was well represented inside of the official COP was going strong. And having heard, before I left the country to join the COP, having heard the president's remarks, which basically said that Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg were going to save us, so no worries about the climate, you know, things were going strong. And, you know, and then sort of scoped out the agreement. It made me feel extremely skeptical about what was going on inside of the official COP, and made me much more interested and invested in the people's movement that was congregating there. And I have to say that in these workshops, which is what came first for me, one was with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was hosting a climate and war workshop. It was very exciting. It felt like we were not only looking the climate crisis in the face, but we were really looking at this incredible blowback from 14 years of this failed war on terror as well, that has only created failed states and massively increased the power of organized global terrorist movements, ISIS and the likes, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, etc., whatever you want to look at by any measure. That has gotten much worse. And also the massive refugee crisis. So there was real consciousness of grappling with that and needing to face both of those problems and to understand, you know, how we had to really have a systemic fix to address them both. And there was, I must say, there was really, in my experience, there was great feeling about, you know, this is it, folks. You know, it's time to stop fiddling around the margins, that we really need a fundamental and unified challenge here among the various justice movements, the justice movements and the peace movement and the climate movement, which are really, we're not going to solve this one piece at a time. We really need a unified and comprehensive approach. And I'll come back to sort of specific positions that we were advocating there. So the other crisis, I think, that was very much on display was, again, this crisis of democracy. So all three of them converging. WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, was one of the workshops. The other one was a French organized workshop, but it was a lot of the European peace groups that were there to grapple with this. And then the other event was this forum, so-called, put on by the Belong organization, which is a nonprofit that works to develop renewable energy in China. And that was extremely interesting and inspired having the indigenous tribes there, as well as the Chinese, and then our sort of Green Party participation. And it was extremely provocative, and it was sort of a person-to-person, you know, across the globe, how can we make this work together, following in the footsteps of the indigenous tribes who've really kind of put out the vision here. How can we rally around this, and how can we break through the institutional barriers? And that was, I have to say, very uplifting. I want to mention the two solutions that we were really putting forward. And first, let me just say a few other words about the official outcome. You know, while there's a lot of good, you know, aspirational language here, you know, it's mostly language without enforcement, without mechanism. It is voluntary, and even at that, the best it will do is 3.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels. So, and it also, you know, eliminated the respect for indigenous rights and their incorporation into the agreement, and it also eliminated the real commitments of climate justice and reparations and support for that transition that the developing world needs to make. So personally, I share the James Hansen point of view that this did not get us there. It didn't begin to get us there, and what made it especially, or I should say made me especially skeptical, was that at the same time the Obama administration and the White House and Congress were lifting the ban on fossil fuel exports, which amounts to creating 350 new coal plants, at the same time that they were approving a new major pipeline, and also including in the budget agreement language that essentially expedites permitting for pipelines. So that fact, you know, in the face of this much ballyhooed agreement, you know, behind closed doors, the absolute opposite of that agreement taking place, to me says where this is really going. And I want to just very quickly describe what we were putting on the table as the way forward, and we were discussing this with China in the sense of how could we, as grassroots movements, really leapfrog ahead against these, this sort of old school view, which is really dictated by fossil fuel companies and predatory banks and war profiteers, you know, who basically sponsor our two establishment political parties and are calling the shots far too much, most of the time, I would say. We're calling for a Green New Deal, which means an emergency program like the New Deal that got us out of the Great Depression, a Green New Deal which will achieve 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, it took us 6 months. We declared a national emergency. It took us 6 months to move the economy to 25% of GDP on a wartime footing. We're calling for doing that now over the next 15 years to move to 100% clean renewable energy. Was a threat to the health and well-being and the security of the United States. That doesn't hold a candle to what we are looking at now, what we are on the threshold of if we don't undertake dramatic reforms now. So we're calling for 100%, creating 20 million jobs now, focused on creating that green economy, green energy, a green agricultural system, a sustainable local food production, as well as transportation, restoring infrastructure and ecosystems. With 20 million jobs, you can actually do that. And guess what? The good news is that the energy transition pays for itself just looking at the health benefits and the costs of the incredible epidemics that we are currently afflicted with right now from fossil fuel production. So this is a win-win. It pays for itself. It revives the economy, which desperately needs a New Deal type solution. It transitions and turns the tide on climate change, and it makes wars for oil obsolete. This is what we deserve, this is what we need, and we should settle for nothing less. And I want to give a big shout out to all the grassroots groups here in Portland who are really leading the way for the nation in how we achieve this, in the way that you have fought back one piece of fossil fuel infrastructure after the other. I say go Portland, the rest of us. City Council resolution that there will be no further construction of fossil fuel infrastructure needs to go national, and we are pushing for that as well, that nationally we have an immediate moratorium on all further fossil fuel infrastructure, and we expedite the transition that our lives and the future of the planet depend on now.
Thank you so much, Jill. How many people in this room were at a hearing or a rally for the fossil fuel policy that Jill just mentioned? Great, so a lot of new faces too. That's awesome. Yes, we are very excited. Jill, it seems like we're pushing for the U.S. to take action at the national level, regardless of what the international community is ready to move on. And we know that in Portland, we're ready to take action as Portland, regardless of what's decided at the international or national levels. And I think that that's a model that we can push forward. So next we will hear from Terry Light, who's a member of Right to Survive, a houseless organizer living at Hazelnut Grove and is in between housing. He has former lives as an activist until he had a break with reality in 1988, and then put himself back together as an Oriental body worker and health educator up to 2008, when he went off the grid to answer the basic question, what are basic human needs? His quest has led him to houseless organizing, beginning with Nicholsville in Seattle on through rewilding work on the Shoshone and Paiute Hoop, and back into the grid at Portland's houseless community, Dignity Village, in 2011. His work is informed by the recovery movement, his understanding, white resistance, solidarity, and he currently works at Common Ground Wellness Cooperative. Terry went to Paris as a member of the It Takes Roots Coalition.
Hi, I did not attend any of the talks, and I haven't been involved in the climate change movement per se. And my first inkling about connecting to it was when I went to the U.S. Social Forum this last summer and connected with Rising Tide, and really hearing a different story about what needed to change, and I was agreeing with those new concepts. That it's not so much about changing our ideas about how we treat the environment, but that the very environment that's creating environmental problems is our social justice structure, and how we treat each other, how we do democracy, how we listen to each other. And out of the blue, I got invited to be part of the It Takes Roots grassroots mobilization, which was made of the Climate People's Action Group, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and also Grassroots Global Justice, which I was part of that. I wanted to bring back more of some impressions I got from organizing with mostly people of color when I went to Paris. We talked over and over about frontline communities, where our communities are already experiencing climate change. You know, we've had the flooding here with Katrina, and the communities responded by pulling themselves together, even though a lot of the rest of the country has ignored the racist implications of how people were taken care of after that crisis. It's continuing to be a case, you know, until we have a problem we're experiencing it ourselves that we do anything about. And that just speaks to the kind of the way our cultural idea has colonized people inside of a colonized system. We believe that the government's still working, but it's partly because we've grown up inside of it, and it seems to be working for us who still have enough privilege to be able to go easy in the world and get help when we need help. Being part of the houseless community, I don't expect help from our police department. I don't expect that if I need something wrong with myself that I'm actually going to get assistance from the community. There's a lot of places where we allow people to be abandoned. When we're talking about Indigenous rights, it's a whole different perspective from the Indigenous point of view. They see their role is to take care of all of their relations, the non-humans, the humans, and also paying attention to a different set of goals that involve the generations. So there was a lot of youth involvement in the groups. There was a lot of elders. There was a lot of talking for different perspectives and coming together and mobilizing. There was a huge amount of passion. We were able to lead the march in the last day, of like really breaking away out of the zone where we're allowed to be in. At the very end, it was a little disappointing that there were 3 projects and not 1, but we decided to attend all those protests. So I came away from Paris thinking about we need to have a change of heart. And it's a process. When I think about how do we start really building community of human beings that are really standing up for the rest of nature, and that rest of nature has a huge way of informing ourselves as human beings, because I feel like our cultures forgot about being human. There's large forces that help us identify if as long as we're a worker, then we're allowed to be able to have food and housing and be part of the culture and be listened to. And experience of being houseless is all of a sudden we don't have access to communicating with other people, because how we've all been taught that if something happens to us, oh, too bad. And it's kind of unacceptable. It's like, how can we hear from the urgency of other cultures? We can't even hear the urgency of ourselves and our own communities when we see it in our face. And I feel like it's kind of a hard work to look at. Like, how do we actually come to that place in our heart and carry that with us as we go through our day? It's a bit of a transition. And I think that's what I was speaking to when I talked about when I first had a break with reality. That was when I first saw Native American organizing and realized that my sense of community, I didn't know anything about community. I grew up in the military, I grew up in a normal family, went to school, at church, and it was like in that community, everybody had a right and a birthright to be taken care of, being warm and fed and sheltered from the storm. That was like a big cause of break for me 20 years ago. And I feel like we're like at this moment where we have to transition a big way where everything changes, including ourselves, including the way we think, including like how we consider each day differently. And I think it's really important, like after we're going to talk more, I think later, like what are our next steps? And I think it's like here, inviting the voices of different perspectives into the room to talk about their experiences with climate change, their experience with how they're organized. And there's this whole level of needing to come from the heart, and there's also the level of really start talking about spiritualities. That there must be something greater than human beings. And we're not the only sentient being on our planet. So there's been a lot of meditating on those things since I came back. one of the last days that we had, the youth led us in an exercise where we appreciated each other. And we don't do that often in direct action organizing because we're so in the war all the time. And that gave me a lot of pause about how traumatizing the very work we're doing is for ourselves. That we have to take time to heal and make that part of our process as human beings in moving forward. And heal and getting to know who we really are. Because nobody really asked us. We went to school. We like assume that we wouldn't know anything and we just have to go to school and learn and then we'll be smart. And some of the Native communities have a different viewpoint. You come in the world and then you're going to discover what you want to do and nobody should tell you what that is. And I feel that strongly about our direct action and organizing, that each person has to decide for themselves in the relationships they're created what their task is at this moment. Mine is, for me, is like, how do I create connection to we're actually in the same room with each other in this present moment and being present so we can have the opportunity to choose differently. Because I felt really strongly interface right now. I don't know where it is.
You have another minute or so if you want.
Huh?
You have another minute if you want. But you don't need to take it.
And so I think here, and it's like one of the things that I was doing is really be inspired to sing more. So I'll just leave you with a song. This is coming from Africa, the wisdom of Africa. Wangari, Mahatma Wangari. Terrible names. She founded the Green Belt movement. And they created their process. There's 4 basic elements to their process for decolonizing. And it's really important for us to understand, as part of that colonizing culture, is that we have to decolonize. So the 4 basic steps for that process for me, and this is a song for that, it's really easy. Love your mother, respect her gifts, stand up, don't sit down, no. Give what you can when you can. You guys can all learn if you want. You guys love your mother, respect your gifts. And I include in that our gifts are each other as human beings, that we're a gift. And so are the animals and the plants and the air and the water. And stand up means to be empowered. And to give when you can, so you don't beat yourself up. Please don't do that. Okay. Love your mother.
Love your mother.
Respect her gifts.
Respect her gifts.
Stand up. Don't sit down, oh no.
Stand up. Don't sit down, oh no.
Give what you can when you can.
Give what you can when you can.
You can do it together. Love your mother. Respect her gifts. Stand up. Don't sit down, oh no. Give what you can when you can. That's it.
Portland Central America Solidarity Commission, or PCASC. Committee. Thank you. Marlena attended COP21 also as part of the It Takes Roots campaign and the Grassroots Global Justice delegation. And part of the It Takes Roots campaign calls on the U.S. representatives to make binding commitments in response to both science and the demands of frontline communities. Marlena has photos for us. Yay! And is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I put lots of pictures up, so I don't have to talk a lot. Maybe the only amendment to that bio is that I have in the past been an organizer with PCASC, and I'm not currently very active, but there's several active people in this room. So if you'd love to raise your hands, then people could know you and talk to you about the brilliant work that PCASC does for my friends over here. So yeah, currently I just do the bookkeeping, but they're the real movers and shakers. All right, great. Cool. So along with Terry and about 60 or 70 other people, we went on this delegation to Paris. It was a delegation that was a collaboration between 3 different groups. So probably between those 3 different groups, we had about over 150 people. But there were 1.5 million things going on in Paris, so I don't think there was ever once we were all in the same room, like maybe one time. But this is our little logo, quite beautiful. And so those 3 groups were the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is made up of member organizations from across the United States, vast majority folks of color, and like frontline and different frontline communities. The Climate Justice Alliance, which I'm still a little iffy on their history, but I believe that that's an alliance that's come out of the COP talks and organizing that's happening between indigenous communities and local communities here in the United States, and then also the Indigenous Environmental Network. And I'm going to talk about mainly, and then this one. So these were the 5 demands that this delegation had, and I'll read them out loud because I think they're awesome. Number 1 is establish mandatory, not voluntary emission cuts at the source. Number 2 is leave fossil fuels in the ground. Number 3 is reject fracking, nuclear power, carbon markets, and other dangerous technologies and false solutions. 4 is strengthen the inclusion of human rights, and particularly the rights of indigenous peoples. And 5 is support community-rooted solutions, including regional and local economic structures that support the production of renewable energy. And I think this is really useful. I don't know, I just read an article today that was sort of about the sort of like lack of concrete demands in the climate movement, and so that's why I wanted to put these up here, because I think they're really clear, actionable items that very easily could have been acted on at the Paris climate talks and weren't, for reasons that I'm sure we all know. But I'm going to talk about 3 main actions that GGJ and this delegation helped organize and helped make happen. The first was this Indigenous canoe action that happened about like 2 days after we got there, and it was basically, okay, I'm not any type of expert on the COP agreement at all, but my understanding is there's a preamble, and then there's like the text of the agreement. And the text of the agreement is what's legally binding, although without any sort of like global police force or whatever. I'm not even sure what like legally binding means, you know? But basically, the IEN and our delegation was fighting to have the rights of indigenous peoples and women and displaced peoples and migrants and refugees like kept in the latter part of the text, which is the legally binding part. And through negotiations, pressure from Western nations, the US, Australia, stuff like that, basically that part got pushed to the non-legally binding preamble part, which I believe is the only place in the text that indigenous rights are mentioned. So in response, tribes from kind of all over the world, there's a really strong delegation from the Lummi Nation who are up in Washington, and they came, and yeah, folks from all over the world came and did this canoe action in a branch of the Seine, is how you say it, that fancy Seine? Yeah. That was really wonderful and awesome, and I think was really effective in sort of like getting that message out there and getting that critique out there. And unfortunately, there was this like one really amazing canoe that looked like that I got to touch and help unload from a truck, which was like up there in like life events ever. This is a canoe that's made by the Sariaku tribe, which is there in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And this canoe is made from one tree. They burned it out of one tree. And they flew it, I guess, from the Amazon to Paris. it was like held up in customs for like a really, really long time, and so I wasn't there for the ceremony. But as part of the ceremony, when it finally got to Paris, it had to be unloaded and touch the water in the same place, and they had to sort of do the part of the ritual that they would have done when the rest of the ritual was going on. So we unloaded it, and then they voted in it. And yeah, it was just, I don't know, super sacred and amazing. I don't know if I can be as articulate as I want to about it. So that was the first big action. The second one, we, in partnership with La Via Campesina, went to the Bon Saint, maybe, detention center, which is, pretty hidden away in this remote, remote corner of Paris. Took like an hour and a half to get there on the train. And there's a bunch of climate refugees who are being held in detention there. So we did a noise demo outside it so that they could hear us inside, and to highlight the hypocrisy of the talks and how, France itself is producing emissions that are causing people to be displaced from their home countries, and then when they come to their borders, putting them in detention centers. And I just, again, with La Via Campesina, that had some really awesome media messaging about the climate talks. And important to note in this, I'm just going to read you this quote, because other people make words better than I do. One of the key recommendations from the Advisory Group on Climate Change and Human Mobility is to fund adaptation strategies that support communities to remain, as well as strategies to safely migrate through a climate change displacement coordination facility. Proposed by low-lying countries in the Global South, the recommendation was opposed by Western countries, especially Australia, and was entirely scrapped from the final agreement. So basically, there was this coalition of developing nations that was like, we need to have agreements about how developed nations are going to handle the influx of climate refugees, and it was one of their main, it's called the LDC, the least developed countries. It was one of their main recommendations leading up to the talks, and before the talks even started, that recommendation was shoved aside by mainly the US and Australia. So nowhere in the text does the word climate refugees appear. Actually, nowhere in the text does the words fossil fuels appear, I learned. So here's some more pictures. Here's some French. It says something in French. These are all awesome people. I wish I could talk to you for hours about how awesome all of them are, but I'm kind of too nervous to even remember anyone's name right now. Okay. And so then the last one, this was sort of GGJ's big day and our big action. It was on December 10th, which was Human Rights Day, and we did an action at the Peace Wall, and the Peace Wall is on the other side of the Champ du Mars from the Eiffel Tower, which is the Park of Mars, which is like the war god. I learned all these towns in France used to have these central parks that were tributes to war gods. So there's a Peace Wall there now, and that's where we decided to have our action. We had, sort of part theater piece, part rally, and there were all these speakers from communities all across the United States, and the intention of the action was basically to call out the U.S.'s role in forcing a corporate agenda in the climate talks, and to talk about how communities in the United States have been resisting and are continuing to resist. So I'm going to read you some words in a few minutes, but basically there were a whole bunch of speakers, really, really beautiful and inspiring. But the theater piece was, the name of the delegation is It Takes Roots to Weather the Storm. So the theater piece was basically sort of identifying the storm, which is what this is, all these different threats, corporations, false solutions, patriarchy, politicians, fracking, all the things. And then basically all these community people kind of rushed in and tore down the problems, the storm. And then we did a big spreading seeds of hope and community and rootedness thing. That's my friend Sarah. She's from Seattle. And then And then we had a big round dance at the end, right there. And I was like trying to come up with inspiring things, and I realized that hella people have already written inspiring stuff about this stuff. So I'm just going to read you a quote from my friend Sheena, who works for the Asian Pacific Environmental Network out in the Bay. And she wrote an article about this action in this day. And she says, "As it stands, the COP21 agreement is brewing another kind of storm for communities on the front line. World leaders converge to talk about greenhouse gas emissions in the parts per million, keeping up endless growth through a force of green consumers, and making sure polluters and their false promises can come along for the ride without losing any profits. Without long-term vision, accountability, and concrete steps to decarbonizing all economies, we're headed toward destruction that neither we nor this planet deserve." At the end of these talks, much is being heralded about the U.S. actually signing on to an agreement despite internal right-wing pressure and climate deniers in Congress. There's a lot of talk about state-by-state innovations, including California Governor Jerry Brown pushing offset agreements with regional partners. These steps are at best helping climate change become a daily conversation. At worst, they're pushing for increased privatization, confiscation of indigenous peoples' lands, loss of cultural and biological diversity, and human rights violations. What we need now post-COP is bold action to keep fossil fuels in the ground, reject the fundamentalist ideology of globalization, a commitment to the well-being of people over the profiteering of a few, and infrastructure and resource support for locally owned and controlled renewable energy solutions. Earlier this month, I traveled to Paris as part of the It Takes Root delegation to build towards just that, a community rooted deeply in place, connected globally through solidarity, and that has the strength and know-how to weather all the storms that are yet to come. We know our communities have been on the cutting edge of true climate resiliency work for generations. We have always been the ones hit first and worst, and we're still here and will continue to lead the transformative path towards a regenerative economy and a living planet. Woo. No, I'm like 3/4 done. Yeah. So then just some other sort of like things. GGJ really emphasizes the need for a just transition into a non-fossil fuel economy and the need to not leave anybody behind in that transition. They had a just transition assembly on one of our finals days there and outlined their principles for a just transition, which I won't read out loud, but they're awesome and you can come look at on my computer later. They did a lot of calling out false solutions, including the RED program, which is reducing emissions through deforestation and destruction, something like that. It's basically, it's a carbon trading scheme. It's pretty evil, and it's being implemented on statewide levels. California is currently engaged on a state level in a carbon trading program with folks in the Amazon, and they called that out left and right and everywhere they could. As well as incineration. Incineration is another one of those false solutions that's being proposed and really turned to, but will still burn us alive. And then some smaller actions that I felt really honored to be a part of. This was a panel. There were two different spaces at the official climate talks, one which you needed a badge to get into, and then one was this sort of like green space where anyone could go into, and it was like full of all this like greenwashing propaganda and weird stuff. And they held a panel there for these climate heroes that included the governor of Vermont, who is actively working to get a frack gas pipeline built in Vermont. Some folks from Canada, someone from California, and then someone from Governor Inslee's office, right? And so like 30 of us rolled in there, and basically every time these folks tried to talk, we just stood up and we shouted them down, right? I got to shout down the lady from Inslee's office about the proposed Tesoro Savage Vancouver oil terminal, and they ended that shit early, you know, and it was really great. The governor Shumlin right there, you can see in the corner, he was prepared for it, like he was like one of those slimy politicians and could deal with it, but like everyone else was just a cabinet member, like they had no clue, like their faces were like draining of blood and you could tell they were kind of shaking and scared. That was really awesome. Yeah, that was some of the most fun I had. And then this other one, I got to go with these ladies, and these ladies are amazing. They are out of Australia. They're called the Climate Angels. It's an all-female collective with a few men in support roles. And briefly, okay, so ENGIE is the biggest energy supplier in the EU, right? And they changed their name recently, but before they changed their name, they were the owners and operators of this coal mine in a rural town in Australia. And they cut back the safety and review budget for this mine until it was only being inspected once every 6 months. So the coal mine caught fire and burned for 45 days before it was put out. And it was only put out through the volunteer efforts of the local town, right? And so kids were coming home from school with nosebleeds, and people were collapsing in the street in the local town. 11 or 12 people have died. So these ladies came from Australia and basically shut down ENGIE's headquarters and blocked the doors, and they had to evacuate the building. And they shut it down for the rest of the day, and it was just they were so amazing, and so powerful, and just really had it together, and were so calm and collected, and all these riot cops showed up, and they didn't flinch, so they're demanding something like $1.2 billion in payment, which is what the county is in debt for cleaning up this fire from this mine. Okay, so this is the second to last slide, and I think just to close, I'll say that Pam Tao Li was on our delegation. She's this amazing Chinese elder. She works for the Chinese Progressive Association out in the Bay right now, but she was one of the founders of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, and she just so full of love and clarity and amazingness. And I called her today and I was like, Pam, I gotta do a report back. I don't know what to say. Tell me what to say. So she said, quote, "Tell them they truly need to hear the voices of frontline communities and authentically take these to heart. The movement we want to build is based on relationships and trust, and the stands these organizations take, especially the big greens and NGOs, are important to these communities. If the leaders of these organizations don't believe their organization is ready to take a stand on colonialism and environmental racism, they need to challenge their membership to step up." That's the very last slide. That's the outside of the climate talks. That says blood for oil on the United States flag. So those are all my pictures from the delegation, and to really, really close, I think I would just say that I want to really echo what Jill said. I'm not a climate scientist. I barely understand this. I did a lot of reading after the talks were over to try to understand what they really mean. These are voluntary commitments. The percentage reductions in terms of current emissions versus the voluntary commitments that people are making to reducing their emissions, the percentages coming out of developing nations are massively higher than the percentages coming out of developed nations. Developed nations are doing everything they can to make these voluntary, non-binding, and to escape every level of responsibility in any way, on a humanitarian way, on an ecological way, on an economic way. That my understanding is that there's going to be these reviews every 5 years. People are hoping for this 1.5 cap, and that basically the carbon budget that would allow for a 1.5 rise in global temperatures will have been spent by the next time that they review agreements in 2020. So there's not I don't know. Yeah. All right, there you go.
Thank you, Marlena. And thank you for sharing the pictures and the words from the other people that inspired you. For anyone in the room who is not super familiar with the role of the climate movement and the role of indigenous resistance to fossil fuels, or why our panelists have been talking about that tonight, we're talking about it not just because it seems to be a trendy topic of calling out the work of indigenous groups, but because all around North America and the rest of the world, indigenous groups have been physically resisting fossil fuel and other types of extraction that have been poisoning their communities for well before the big green groups even existed. So I think that the climate movement is starting to a little bit catch on to the work that's been done, and hopefully learn from the way these groups are approaching the topic, because we got so excited about those 5 demands that the It Takes Roots campaign put up there, and those ideals seem to line up, at least with what I hope for in the world. Also, I've often seen that the work of indigenous communities in resisting the fossil fuel projects is a community building project, and so we don't have to just learn what's been done and what's effective in indigenous communities to resisting fossil fuels as an obligation, but as a possibility for how we could envision community building in the white or settler communities as well. So we'll start the question and answer period here, and before we get started with that, I just wanted to sort of preface what this panel is for the 350 PDX group, 350 Portland group, and 350 PDX has been engaged in a 6-month campaign in which the Paris climate talks were sort of planted in the middle, and that campaign is called Road Through Paris, and it's based on the idea that the Paris climate talks were never the end or the goal of the work that all of these people who are involved in the grassroots movement are doing, but instead we know that there's work on the other side, and so let's start planning that before the talks happen. So we wanted to hear what happened at the Paris climate talks, not as a sort of assessment as to whether the entire grassroots movement has either succeeded or failed, but as a stepping stone along the way to succeeding in the goals that we all have and can achieve as people, united. So, that being said, I want to open the floor up to questions, and we'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for questions, and we'll send you on your way. I have a question for the people in the back. Can you hear very well?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yay! Excellent. Thank you. So you can shout out your question, and I'll repeat it so that our cameras can hear you, and then we'll pass it to the panelists. Yes?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, don't doubt the power of your voice, because you did an excellent job presenting. And also, I want to say about the power of words. My teacher, Michael Sunleitner at UCC, says that we have to be careful what words we choose. When we say developing nations, it's like they're not as good as us. They need to develop. So he likes to use industrialized nations versus non-industrialized nations, because industrialized is not necessarily better. In fact, non-industrialized might very well be better. We can learn from those countries. So that's something I wanted to state. But also, the question is, how can people plug into your organization? It Takes Roots, because it seems like you're doing some great stuff.
The question is, how can people plug into the work that you're doing at It Takes Roots?
Do you want to answer?
I'm going to say the Grassroots Global Justice that we're a part of was actually coming out of the U.S. Social Forum. They split off and are continuing to do some of the work that U.S. Social Forum was doing. There are many, many things to do in social justice work. I think reading Naomi Klein's book is a really great step if you haven't read it yet. This Changes Everything. It's an awesome book. I think it elaborates quite a bit about what's in front of us to look at and change. I think dealing locally around like Black Lives Matter, that was an integral part of our group. They had an action there too at Paris. So internationally looking at how Black Lives Matter. We have a white solidarity network group here to help deal with history of whiteness and how to support people of color. Surge, I think it's, I forget what the initials are. That's a group that's in town.
Grassroots Global Justice is very intentionally trying to be, and is a sort of like member coalition organization of frontline communities. And it was super interesting, and to be a white person on that delegation, it was mainly not white people. And this is going to sound weird, but like I think they want to keep it that way. So I think it is a question for me about like how do we as white allies best support that work and lift it up, while not necessarily, you know, it's strange to be sitting on this panel repping them, and I'm definitely trying to get some of the other folks who are on that delegation from the Pacific Northwest to come and have a panel, because I'm like, it's strange to have the report back be two white people when we were the vast minority on this delegation, and it doesn't completely feel appropriate. So that was where I was like, God, I don't know how to answer that question, because it's a question I'm asking myself at the moment, like how do I uplift that without necessarily needing to be a part of it, you know? Sorry, I don't have a clear answer. Check.
Yes, Marion.
I just wanted to mention I was there also, and Pat Freiberg from Vancouver was there. It's really interesting to hear the panel. I saw Jill there actually at the War and Militarism and Climate workshops. I went to 2 of those. Also connected, I went to a workshop on the TPP and how that is affecting climate change, and because there's a lot of additional shipping that will be going on and a lot of non-local products made. We went to a women's conference where Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, was there, and there was a conference on fracking we couldn't get into, unfortunately. It was just full. But there was a People's Assembly, which I think you probably were at, for one whole weekend in Monterey, and it was just fabulous. There were lots of workshops and things going on. And then at the ZAP, which was a whole other area of the city, for a whole week there were workshops and all kinds of activities. And there was a People's Assembly that Naomi Klein was there one day, and anyway, there were like 2,500 people there, and if you've been to Occupy and seen how that operates, this was 2,500 people. It was amazing how that went. So, there were a lot of, I was in an action at the Louvre, actually, where the Climate Angels were there, too, which was really good, and we went to the demonstration. So, to me, the overall thing that I got out of it, I think the most, was there are a lot of young people and people of color that really are leading the movement, and a lot of grassroots people, and it was just so heartening to see that for me, because we don't see that so much here now anyway. Maybe in Portland, but the rest of the country we don't see that. So it was very exciting to see people from all over the world speaking all these different languages coming together. And my favorite sign, you had it on your slide, was no war, no warming, because I'm a peace activist. And so it's nice to see the connections of all these groups. I saw Black Lives Matter people. I saw a lot of indigenous people everywhere. They were kind of the front lines, as you mentioned. So anyway, it was very exciting for us to be here. I just wanted to
I want to thank the panel. It was very informative. A couple, Dr. Stein and Terry touched on the fact about the need for changes, and as you were talking, we're talking about the climate, but it connects to everything. How do we get changes like that? Because our minds tend to think of, well, we're solving this one problem, and it connects to everything else. How do we maybe get that holistic system change?
So the question for the people in the back who couldn't hear is, there's so many issues, and as our panelists mentioned, they're connected. How do we work on all of them when it's so hard to even just get through one of them?
Part of what I came back with is really how do I work locally, building the relationships. If you go think about the theme of people over profits, and no war, like what does that mean on a daily interaction level? What does it mean to get closer to each other so we don't have to use so much escaping items? Like a lot of things we do in our life is just escape the present moment or escape the way we feel. go shopping, go do all these things to take care of our bodies as if like our life is so stressful, and like how do we unpack that? Do a lot of soul searching. I mean, that's where I'm at a lot with myself. I'm part of a community where our struggle is just to like how to get along and think of we rather than me. Getting out of that I, like as if my life mattered more than everybody's. Which of course our lives matter. I'm not saying they don't. But we tend to think about just our life. Or we tend to just think about just our children. Or just ours. But there is this whole thing about how do we think about all our relations? How do we think about relationships are more important than money? How do we think about not being so comfortable and making those sacrifices because we've been living so easy? It's a lot of stuff to do, and we also need to come together politically. And that, it's like there's a whole process of dialogue that needs to happen, and also action. And it's, I think the actions are different for each one of us because we're all different and we have different capabilities and different perceptions and talents. For me, I'm moving in, how do I go back into that health providing role that I used to have that takes in community building. A lot of the issues that I see is like how do we break down the generational traumas as white people. We have a whole history and culture of the burning times that happened that really changed our culture. That's based around how capitalism began. And women experience that still every day, that recovery from that process, that they're not, moving beyond being a woman that makes babies that can go to the worker capitalistic machine. How do we move from machine aspect of being a worker or a role to being carbon-based units where we have organic needs and rhythms and timing? Like, how do we take the time to learn to dance again? You move our bodies. These are all things that help break down the trauma. But these are my own thoughts and my own proclivities because of who I am. And each one of you have talents, just like how do you go reach out and create community and believe in something different than just my own survival? And that's like kind of a climate of fear. How do we go and pass that climate of fear and be brave for ourselves and take that adventure and make different choices? I don't know, those are some of my thoughts, but you probably have some different thoughts. So, yeah.
I want to affirm those thoughts, which I think are really important. And I think we operate on many different spheres at the same time, and our spiritual and our basic community connections to each other and to the planet are really important. And at the same time, I think that, as you said as well, that the political context of this is really important. In my view, political means power. And currently we are facing extremely powerful forces, and whether you call it the capitalist, economic elite, or corporations, or whatever you call it, there are very powerful entrenched forces which have become much more powerful within our lifetimes, and which have a very deadly kind of power, and which threaten us now on all dimensions of our lives. There's a saying from way back, from like early sailor culture, that when you're in a storm, you need one hand for yourself and you need one hand for the ship. And I think it's really important for us to do things, for ourselves individually, spiritually, where we are, and locally. But if that's all we do, then we will continue to be overwhelmed, divided, and conquered at a time that is extremely perilous for us as individuals, cultures, nations, for the biosphere, you know, and we're in that sixth great extinction right now, which is barreling forward rapidly. And we cannot only, you know, do this as individuals. It's really important for us to move together. And in my very, you know, limited understanding of history, and I'm not a history person, but you know, you definitely see that social change is really driven by social movements throughout history, whether you're looking at, you know, the labor movement or the women's movement or civil rights movement. There have been movements. Movements are really the engine, in my view. But political voice, I think, is a very important part of social movements getting traction. And in my view, it's very important for us to also struggle politically because it's a unifier. It enables us to get to critical mass. And in my view, we have critical mass. We have critical mass. The numbers of people who support a basic agenda of justice, whether you're looking at 43 million young people who are trapped in debt right now, who deserve to be liberated from that debt. Our country chose to liberate the bankers and Wall Street who caused that debt. It's long past overdue time to liberate young people.
Yeah.
That's critical to the climate movement, because if we're going to have the force of a social movement, it needs to be led not only by frontline communities, but by youth, which is one of those frontline and very oppressed communities right now, who's saddled with debt and low-wage jobs and an economy that does not create new jobs, and the crisis of the climate. This is all falling on the shoulders of young people. So liberating young people, I think, is really critical as part of that movement, but that we need to come together in a more explicit way. And in the same way, we need to exercise, I think, direct action and civil disobedience out in the streets. We also need to do it in the voting booth, and to use the tools of our democracy to stand up for what we deserve and to vote for what we are for and not simply against what we fear. I think we need to bring our moral compass into our political life and really define the world that we want, not just retreat from the world we're afraid of, because doing that sort of leaves the predators to fill the gap. If we're not speaking up for the justice that we deserve, then we're essentially entrusting the corporate predatory political system to do it. So, you know, I think it's a very challenging time right now where it's us, you know, it's us joining together through the social movements, which are critical, and I think one hand also for political action, which is essentially about changing power. That if we want justice, we need power, and by we, I mean a broad coalition for people, planet, and peace over profit. We need that broad power of our numbers and to come together in an explicit way with a clear agenda, like that, you know, 5-point agenda of It Takes Roots. That really is a national agenda as well as a global agenda. This is the agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit. It's up to us.
Because I think Mother Earth is just simply saying we erred somewhere. And for everybody in different ways, and I know for myself, I've had weeks. What my part was that, what my presumptions would carry off as a woman, as a white person, my own privilege, my own assumptions, how I have unwound that. But as I unwind that, there was great sadness. There's been great sadness in the sort of my own hands in that. And yet understand there was not evil doing in that. So there was illusion or delusion. But very often when I'm places and there aren't people like this in the room, I feel a little crazy, you know, because a lot of people are going, well, you know, just get on with it. They just go about their day, they're shopping, they're doing, they're in denial, they don't really want to talk about what's happening. So
in part, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody in this room and for what you're doing and for the heart, and sometimes it's anger and sometimes it's grief and sometimes it's our spiritual reaction and sometimes it's, like you say, one hand on and one hand here. But it's beautiful, and I just wanted to thank everybody because I often do feel crazy in rooms that aren't like this.
Yes, all the way in the back.
Yeah. So, I hope you don't mind, but I had to comment. You were talking just a minute ago about the relationship with indigenous peoples and how it needs to be nurtured. Some of our biggest gains in the ecological world, of course, has been through tribal entities and treaty rights. I think that will continue to be something that will happen again and again in the next probably 5 to 10 years. There's a movement afoot to continue to erode the legal entity of tribes. That's significant. I don't speak for all indigenous peoples. I am a tribal member, and I've had some experience in fighting for labor, for ecology, for indigenous rights, for human rights. I think one of the things we can do, and that everybody can do, is, first of all, you have to have a little bit of truth. And that truth is looking at yourself. And really what that means and what that sacrifice means. Because particularly in this country, we're largely very spoiled, self-centered individuals. And I don't mean that to be mean. It's just what our society has made us in this situation. I look at what's happening at the refuge here in Oregon. And we have people up there that are, get rid of these patriot occupiers, give it back to the people it belongs to. Yeah, well, I gotta tell you folks, it belongs to the Paiute. And they were willing to share that, if we'll remember, but that wasn't good enough. We had to kill those people, march those people off, and take that. I think, there's a little bit of partnership of them trying to take care of that again now, but I think they've proven their ability to take care of that, and that'll be turned back over to them, and I'm sure they'll share that with us in very generous ways in teaching. But I think as we go back there and learn what indigenous people need to survive, that teaches us how to live in that situation and what it means to be able to change our society to become what we need to be and to change the ills that we have on a day-to-day basis. The way we look at ourselves, the way we look at our community, the way we look at our families. That's significant. It's important. But we ignore these things. We ignore that on my reservation, the life expectancy is 45 years old. Our unemployment is at 96%. We don't have the ability, we don't have food banks. We don't have firewood. We don't have natural gas, even though they're taking it right off of our reservation. We don't have the power, even though they're taking the uranium off of there and leaving all the crap on the ground and in our water, and that our people are dying from that our children are cancerous and have disabilities that they shouldn't be having. We don't have unemployment insurance. We don't have these things on a day-to-day basis that all of you enjoy, and you're so poor. Well, my ass, you're not poor. What you are is ignorant of the facts. And again, I don't mean to be mean, but you are. That, to me, is a tragedy. Not knowing that that's happening on a day-to-day basis, not only on my reservation, but all over the place. Those are the poorest places in the United States. But do you know them? Do you know those people? Do you know their plight? Do you know what they need to survive and to become what they used to be? Do you know the things that they have to do, that they have to prostitute themselves to do, to get along, to be able to eat, to put their children through school? No, you probably really don't. But those are the things that you do need to learn, and those are the things that you need to do and to bring them up so that they can bring you up. Because they're willing to share that. And they've made the sacrifices to keep that in their community and to keep that as a way of life so that they can share it with you. So take that opportunity to go back and learn from that. Train yourself from that. Be part of that community, and they'll let you be part of their community, and I think we'll probably get this thing by the hand. And vote for Bernie.
Vote for Bernie.
Thank you for sharing your story with us and for giving us a to-do list of work to do. So there we go. People who are wondering what to do next.
Something to do.
There's a good list to start you with.
First rule of organizing.
There we go.
I'm going to ask a question. I think the thing that so bothers me is there's a lot of activists in this room. I recognize a lot of you. I know what a lot of you have done. I know the thousands of dollars that some people have spent, getting involved in peace and justice issues, traveling all over the country, attending conferences, going to Europe, going to Nicaragua, going to Palestine, And I've done a fair amount of that myself. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace. I was an Army medic in Vietnam. And I think one of the things that bothers me, and I think you've got some, you might have some answers to this, is that there are so many people that are in the know, but they choose to do nothing. I cannot tell you how many active, how many progressive people, how many liberal-minded people that I know who are aware of what's going on, but they have intellectual conversations at Starbucks. They give you 2 thumbs up when you're holding a sign on the corner somewhere, but they don't join them. I have a friend of mine, I'm not going to say who it is, she's in this room. She's an avid anti-war activist and an avid climate activist. I have a tremendous amount of respect for her. And she told a story to me one time that was funny, because I think we need to look at the story. She was explaining to a friend what she'd been doing, and after she got through explaining it, her girlfriend looked at her and said, "You go, girl." And I never will forget that statement when her friend looked at her after she explained all the things that she was doing, and she said, "You go, girl." And I'm thinking to myself, what? You go, girl? That's, and I think that's what's so frustrating for all of us, is that there aren't any free lunches. I mean, can you imagine the 5 of you, let's say you're playing in an NBA team, and you play 82 games a year, and all 5 of you have to play the entire game, 82 games of the year, and nobody comes in to relieve you? Can you imagine what that does to us? So, I mean, if anybody's got some ideas of how do you recruit people, what do you have to do to get them to at least join you on the street corner with a sign? Anybody?
The question was, how do we recruit people?
That's a good question. I mean, I can only talk from my personal experience, right? And in some ways that's limited because I didn't have friends before I was an activist, so all my friends are activists, and I can't recruit them to do anything with me because they're all so freaking busy. So there's that, right? Like people, right, in my life now, people try to recruit me to be part of their campaigns, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm trying to do a million things, I can't, so there's definitely that small sector of the population, but that's not most people. And I think when I reflect on my own personal process, the big block to action was all of the time I spent not taking action and having to process just sort of like I don't know, it's just sort of, it's like that magic journey that like leads you to empowerment, right? Like, how do you become that person who is like, I don't know exactly what the word is, but like whatever your skill set is, willing to deploy your skill set for your political convictions, right? Like despite pressure, despite the state, despite the critique, despite the way like people kind of treat you like you're weird, right? Because like when I go and I talk to normal people, you know, and I tell them what I do with my time, it's actually really hard. Like I was up at this meditation retreat last year, and at the end of the retreat, you don't talk for 9 days, right? At the end of the retreat, everyone's like blah, 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 and it's like kind of overwhelming, and everyone's like, what do you do, you know? And I was really hard. It was really hard for me to be like, I do community organizing to stop fossil fuel infrastructure, you know? Because as soon as you say that, it just brings sort of the conversation to this level of reality that most people aren't really interacting with. Yeah. And suddenly, all of a sudden, they're feeling all the things, right? Like, they're feeling like, oh my God, climate change is gonna kill me, you know? And like, my society's collapsing and I never talk about it. And you're so empowered and I'm not empowered and you're doing everything and I'm doing nothing. And it's like, I can't deal with that. You know, I'm gonna deal with that every single time I tell someone what I do. So I'm like, for money, I do bookkeeping. You know, like that's the easy answer to the question. But I noticed, I was like, that's not like, I spend countless hours in meetings being like, how do we get people involved, right? And then I have an opportunity to have a like one-on-one conversation with someone who maybe wants to like log down to something or make a donation. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't remember what I do. You know, like it's ridiculous, right? And so like, I feel like it's like that journey that people are on, like wherever they're at, if they're not taking action, they probably have hella feels about the fact that they're not taking action, you know? And they probably need someone to hold their hand and talk to them about the feels and talk to them about like, this was my journey. Here's how I went from like never really feeling at all empowered whatsoever to like being able to get up and facilitate a room full of 200 people, right? And like you need to humanize it for them, and you need to share why it's rewarding, which for me is a big challenge because we don't win very often. But I would say that like the stuckness, I think, is because we are all raised in this culture, at least for me, and I'm guessing for many of you, in which we're like trained from day number 3 to be disempowered, right? So it's like an uphill journey to actually find the clarity and rootedness in yourself to say like, I'm gonna do this thing. You know, like when we walked into that panel that I showed you with the governors and stuff, I'm like, ooh, you know, like there's nothing about it that's easy. And it's choosing to do the not easy thing again and again and again while you're watching your hope for like saving the planet like spiral down the drain, you know? And sort of like at the end of the day, you're like, well, I guess I'm gonna go do another action because I don't know what else to do, right? Even though I'm not at all convinced that it's effective or we're winning or anything's changing. But it's just like getting people to that point where they're that convinced, and that dedicated, I think, only comes through actually like finding that truth in themselves, you know? And the only way I've ever found to lead people to that truth is to talk to my journey, right, to that truth or whatever. As an uplifting story, you know, I was like radicalized in 2008 when like the economy was going to collapse and stuff like that. And my whole worldview was shifted. It was really amazing. I started talking on the phone to my family about it, especially my dad, right? And so then 3 years later, when Occupy comes around, my dad ends up being like the financial manager for Occupy Boston, right? And I'm like, oh, I never would have thought you'd do that. Like, oh, why'd you go down to the camp? And he was like, because you've been talking my ear off for the past 3 years. I had to do something. So it can work, you know? All right, there, everyone. I'm done.
I might just say a couple words adding on to that, because basically it is intimidating, right? Some people are naturally activists and love to hold the signs and love participating in civil disobedience, but for a lot of people, for the mainstream, it is intimidating. I used to do a lot of canvassing and knocking on doors to fundraise for environmental and social causes, and you know, you get doors slammed in your face, you get people that yell at you or say mean things, and I can't tell you the number of times I just sat on the curb and cried. And that's that's what people fear. They fear if they step out of the mainstream and they're the person holding the sign on the street corner that they're going to be made fun of, basically. And so you have to take the little things that people can do and are doing and at least recognize those, help them convince themselves it's making a difference, and at least recognize those actions, and then I think slowly help them build up to bigger, maybe more frightening things that hopefully are making a difference. But I think we're all always asking ourselves whether we're making any sort of a difference. So that's just my 2 cents.
Also, you can try asking them.
Yeah, and to answer that question a little bit more, too, for me is I'm also with Veterans for Peace.
Would you mind standing up so the doc can hear you, too?
I'm also with Veterans for Peace, and I think too often we assume that people aren't active. And you don't know, people are paralyzed by work, by the struggles that they're involved in. You don't know if that person who didn't come and join your organization isn't taking care of a disabled child, a parent that needs, has Alzheimer's. We don't know what their individual story is, but what I found that was important to me in becoming recruited into Veterans for Peace, and it took me many, many years because I was in denial of wanting to be a part of any group, it was hearing the stories, other people's stories. Everybody has a story. And their story began to match with the things that I was thinking about. And I believe most people, I have faith in people. I believe, I'm not the person that says they're all bad and they just don't know what they're doing. I really think that people are paralyzed in a lot of ways to be able to act, but they would want to act. And we have to make room for them to act. And we need to have those stories that inspire people. It inspired me. Not only just people, but books, history, reading and learning. Howard Zinn's People's History is a great way to learn. Being a part of the labor movement. Now you may be a part of many, many different groups, the feminist movement, student movements, whatever is being done. Right now I think Black Lives Matter is actually covering all of these issues. I was in a conversation with a guy the other day who was telling me, well, Black Lives Matter isn't addressing the issues of the economy. It's not addressing the issues of poor people. It's not addressing, it's only dealing with black lives. I said, where the hell have you been? What have you been reading? That's all I hear. 15 Now, the environment, all of these things they're talking about because they don't go to those events. And sometimes the only way we can get those events to people is through video, through technology, through a radio show. These kinds of things are important. And I think that's what one of the questions was, is how do we get beyond just the choir? And sometimes the choir, we need that choir to sing loudly so that the audience can hear it. And that sometimes the way we reach them is through what we publish, what we write, what we can do an interview with. But if we get that out in the media, that's a great way to do it. Thank you.
So we'll take 2 more questions, and then if people want to speak to the panelists or anyone else who wants to linger for a few minutes afterwards, that'd be great. Yeah.
Jill, right? So you said earlier politics is power. I might be metaphorically speaking here, but how loud is your roar? Honestly, I think these people listen to you, because I honestly think that they have an. You're not going to mess with their agenda, no matter what you say to them.
And it's not just me. Let me put it this way. Right now, if you look at polls say that 21% of the American public is Republican, and 29% is Democrat, and 50% has rejected them both.
Yeah.
There are a lot of unhappy campers out there who are all being thrown under the bus. There are other polls as well that show, in fact, majorities disapprove and have unfavorable opinions of the 2 corporate political parties.
And then there's the Koch brothers.
So, what was that?
And then there's the Koch brothers.
And there's money pouring in. Absolutely. And we are told over and over again that we the people are absolutely powerless. So forget it, pack up and go home. You know, it's over, folks. That's the message that is driven into our heads because they know that we have the power to overthrow them.
That's not driven into my head.
Well, that's awesome. And there are a lot of people out there in this room and around, you know, all across the country and around the world. You know, this system is self-destructing. Mm-hmm. It is collapsing. Numbers just came out the other day that 64 billionaires now have as much wealth as half of the world's population. Another way to look at that is that the 1%, the global 1% now has more than the 99% all put together. So let me just say something about that. That means that if you have 2 loaves of bread, okay, the fat cat in the room gets 1 loaf. Say there are 100 people. The world's population is 100 people. The richest one guy gets 1 loaf. 99 people have to share the other loaf. And that's not enough to live on.
So basically you're saying, like, if they do like a population control thing, the 1%ers get to stay and everyone else has to go.
Well, you could say that's what our economy has done. Our economy and our political system, which is about concentrating power. But let me just say that as much as they are trying to stay the course and circle the wagons around their little power structure, they are failing, and people are dropping away madly from this system, and they're looking for somewhere else to go and another way to live. And how do we create communities that are really, you know, inherently just and sustainable? So they're selling it and they're packing the dollars behind it, but they're still losing their battle, and the numbers are getting bigger all the time. And, you know, what I'm saying is that, you know, I used to think that we had to get out there and change people's minds. And over the years, I'd have to say, I've become convinced that history is changing people's minds. And the economy is changing people's minds. And the climate and the course of the environment is changing people's minds. That we are being radicalized massively now. And our job is no longer to change people's minds. Our job is to get out there and organize the numbers that we already have. We have the numbers. And let me just say, I'm not here to talk as a candidate, and I'm not going to talk as a candidate. But I want to mention that in the past, when we have broken into televised debates, when we've been able to fight our way into televised debates, we win those debates. And I myself have participated in a televised statewide debate where our ideas of justice and sustainability went over like lead balloons inside of the TV studio. But when we walked out, we were mobbed by the press, who told us we won the debate on the instant online viewer poll. So the point I want to make is that, you know, in the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We do have the power.
However, I think it goes in numbers. Like, the more numbers you have, the more power you have, not politics. I mean,
that's right.
It's the more people you have doing what you're doing.
Exactly.
Fighting for what you're fighting for.
That's right. And at the end of the day, I agree, it really is the social movements. But grappling with the political structure is part of how you can propagate those social movements at a time when people are paying attention. Right. And that's our job, is to advance our power as a people. And, you know, I think the goal is not necessarily, everybody wants to win an election, but there are more ways to win than by winning an office. You know, if you are ever going to change the power structure, you have to challenge it. In the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. If you're going to advance an agenda for justice, you have to stand up and shout it out. And courage is contagious, and the work that people do in standing up, you know, and committing civil disobedience and doing direct action. It is a very powerful act that has much more power beyond the immediate moment. And people are very inspired, I think, by these stories and pictures of courage and of vision and this narrative, this counter-narrative. There's a elitist narrative out there that we're all, in it to be money grubbers, and wealth is good and greed is good. That's kind of a conventional wisdom. But there's a counter-narrative that we are part of Mother Earth, and that we are aspiring towards that tradition of the indigenous cultures, and that we are building communities, and that we can have a world that works for all of us. And we can do that. And our job, in my view, is to advance that vision as much as we possibly can in our work as members of social movements and as those social movements come together. In my view, that's what politics is supposed to be. It's about a coalition of justice that coheres across time, across geography, and across generations.
But that's just not the case, though.
It's not in the conventional politics, in the money-dominated politics, and I think I would not have anything to do with that at all.
So, how loud is your voice?
As loud as we make it. And let me just say, as a social movement, we have stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership now for a year. It was supposed to have been passed a year ago. The president is going to sign it on February 4th, but it doesn't mean a damn thing. It's not a done deal until legislation is put before Congress, and then they've got 90 days to pass it. So starting on February 4th, there are going to be direct actions all over the country to stand up and fight against the TPP. We stopped the Federal Communications Commission from privatizing the internet. Our voice was never out there on corporate media. Our voice was never there. We stopped the first Syrian war, you may remember, back in 2012, because the timing was right and we were able to stand up and really scream about it. We were able to stop the first bombing campaign. That never got out on the corporate media. We have shut down nuclear power plants. How many times has Portland stopped a fossil fuel plant from being created? Many times. We don't hear about that on public media. But we have ways to end run the corporate stranglehold over our communications. And this is about developing our power, our communications, not taking marching orders from them, and above all, not by being told that we are powerless. Forget the lesser evil, stand up and fight like hell for the greater good.
I'm going to take one more question, and then if you have additional questions, and the panelists would like to stay even longer, then I will stay longer as well. Yes?
Sorry, my English is broken, so I need help.
I'll translate. Great.
Para ustedes que fueron a París,
For those of you that went to Paris,
¿cómo pueden interpretar o ilustrarnos
how can you interpret or show us
el mensaje de los indígenas,
the message of the indigenous,
o de los humanistas o los ecohumanistas?
or the humanitarians or the eco-humanitarians?
Porque nosotros en Latinoamérica y en el Caribe,
Because those of us who live in Latin America and in the Caribbean,
donde tenemos todos los climas,
where we have all climates,
donde está más la biodiversidad en el mundo,
where there's more biodiversity in the world,
está siendo atacada por las transnacionales.
it's being attacked by transnational corporations.
Y mi pregunta para ustedes, como organizadores de picas,
And so my question for you all, as organizers,
¿cómo se puede ser dentro de los países industrializados, civilizados?
how,
¿Qué tipo de modelo, perdón?
how from the inside of the industrialized country,
¿Qué tipo de modelo podemos hacer? ¿En qué tipo de verdades podemos construirlas? ¿Qué verdades podemos construirlas? ¿Qué tipo de circunstancias?
what kind of models can we create to change the paradigm?
Porque tengo poco tiempo en Estados Unidos acá. Poco tiempo.
Because
because I have just a little bit of time here.
Y yo veo que la conciencia con la ciencia están muy separadas.
And I'm seeing that the consciousness and science are very separate.
Nosotros, ella, mi esposa, hicimos un proyecto en la radio comunitaria y paramos una mina, un proyecto de mina transnacional.
My partner and I have created a community radio station to stop a mining project.
Yo quisiera que nos explicaran cuál es la acción para que las personas en la conciencia con la ciencia estuvieran más ecuacionadas. Muchas gracias.
I'd just like to hear a little bit more about how we can bring science and consciousness together to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to take that one?
Thank you for the question. One thing that, this might not totally answer your question, but do I need to stop for translation? Okay. One thing that's kind of interesting about the Paris Agreement is that it's not a top-down agreement. It's a bottom-up agreement in the sense that governments officially decide at the national level what their contribution to the agreement is going to be. And that actually gives a huge opportunity for civil society and citizens in their own countries to affect what governments do in this intergovernmental process, which is notoriously hard to influence unless you have a lot of money. So the nationally determined contributions that have us on a path to 3 degrees Celsius or more, those can be revised before 2020, and parties have the opportunity to do that. And so one of the ways that civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities have an opportunity to change that is by influencing their governments to make their contributions to the agreement more ambitious. So that's one way that these two things sort of link together, the social movements we've been talking about and the sort of bureaucratic intergovernmental process that came up with this agreement.
I'm going to just say, to suggest a few ways that the struggles of the indigenous and of refugees and of the countries of Latin America, some of the ways that they come together with the struggle against climate, with the struggle against corporations, with the struggle against corporate trade agreements. These struggles, I think, are so interconnected that it underscores how we benefit really from working together and thinking of ourselves as a global movement for people, for the planet, for peace over profit. There are many pieces of this movement. We all have our struggles, depending on where we are and the focus of those struggles. But the more we can connect together, the more momentum we build. And I want to say how important the indigenous struggles have been to making progress on all of these fronts. Many of us were in Lima the year before. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to go to Cajamarca, where the indigenous people and the peasants and the campesinos led the struggle against the mines, which were polluting their water supply and actually draining their lakes and really taking the water away so that they could have their gold mine. And it was just staggering to see people who had no material possessions, no electricity, living up in the mountains, who had basically stood against the mining companies, who had stood against the military in Peru, and basically just armed with sticks had said, "You will not pass." And they had protected their other lakes and had prevented the mines from moving forward. And they had elected an opposition government. They elected a communist government. We would call it socialist here. They actually created they were a social movement, and they created a political change around that, and they were holding the fort. Same thing in Bolivia, where the indigenous people had led the fight against Bechtel and their privatization of the water supply, and they stood up, and they had basically an occupation in the streets that went on for many months, and they drove Bechtel out. They regained their water. They took back their water supply. This is a struggle that's being repeated all over the world. Now in Flint, Michigan, under different terms, and in Detroit, and in Philadelphia, where our water supplies are being privatized, and where national support for water systems has basically been evaporated, and instead we've privatized water supplies and created a system of loans that forces communities to then charge skyrocketing rates for their water. And, we can't just fight this alone. We can't fight this alone anywhere. And the more we are unified, I think, within our country and across borders, the more we are unified for an agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit that has a system change mission. It's not only to fight the particulars, but to fight the whole system that has put these predatory corporations in charge of our lives and our economy and our planet. We've got to fight that, and we've got to get together to fight that. So I just, I want to respect the leadership of the indigenous tribes, and I will say also that by protecting the tribes, we protect the land. And if we want to protect the land, we also have to protect the indigenous. So, they go together, and it's really important that we approach this holistically and that we work together. And the struggles of our frontline communities, which I think you two can also speak to now, we help lead the way, with all of those frontline communities really are at the forefront of this struggle. So I salute you for the work that you're doing. Where you are, and thank you for being here and maintaining this dialogue, because we're all in this together. That's the only way we're going to fix it. Thank you.
I think it's like, I don't know, it's just every day there's so many people to connect to. I'm looking forward to has this organization here finding a way to bring everybody into the room. It's like, what do we all need? How can we support each other? Bringing in indigenous communities, the people of color communities here in town, sit in the same room. How is this whole thing impacting each of us? What do we need to do first? What can we do? What's our priorities? Having that conversation together. Those are my thoughts. How do we bring people into the same room? Listening to leadership of people who've been organizing for a long time to struggles to save and protect their lands, and paying attention to what's necessary, what kind of supports people need. When I was working at Big Mountain, the people there at Big Mountain needed people to watch their sheep so they can go do the political work. And that was really different work. It was not an analysis job. It wasn't an important job per se, but it was still really important to have happen. But we need to have us all in the same room. I think that's the first step.
Was the question what models do we need to have here?
Yeah, because I learn more. I learn many things here. People struggle inside the capitalism, United States empire, like Europe, Latin America, and Africa. We are struggling friend to capitalism. It's super hard. So, but I like when we need to be together in all the movement, but to be in friend to be in front of the same Mother Earth is learn more, grow our spiritual. So I want to know, I don't have the solution. How we can find the truth. You know what I mean? So she learned more when she is in my country or in Honduras. It's bad situation, Honduras. Super bad situation. It's neoliberalism. So I feel super bad in my heart. But people, almost 3 years I'm here, so people, they don't know about Latin America. You know, I don't have that solution though. So how we can find
I mean, I don't have the solution either. So I don't know. It's like 9 o'clock at night. I think you all want to go. So I'm just going to take this opportunity to talk about what I want, right? Because I came home from Paris and it was basically like, it's not like I have faith in like these like international governments at all to ever do the right thing, but they have so many resources that if they chose to do the right thing, it would be amazing. You know, like I would have loved to come home from Paris and be like, you know, like not that like all of empire and capitalism and colonialism is fixed, but there's like at least there will be water and food, you know? And so I really have not talked to anyone. Like, I didn't really talk about Paris to my family or my friends because it's weird because you go home and you're like, oh, I just came back from this big government thing where, like, basically they kind of decided to torch the planet and now I'm going to have Christmas with my family, you know? Like, it's totally disorienting. So the thing that I want is I want to make where I live a place that is utterly inhospitable to fossil fuels, right? Like, I want us to block the trains for a year. I want no trains to get by. I want nothing to be built. And I've spent the past 2 or 3 years of my life trying to make that happen, and I'll clap too, but I honestly don't know how to make it happen, right? Like, the, like, river of arrestees that are deployable for direct action, it's like this deep. It's not this like big surge of people, right? So I don't know what it takes to make it happen. I don't know what it takes to build the social movement we need to topple an empire. And I know we need it. And I know that there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the city who are working to make it happen. And I don't know what the breaking point is going to be. You know, like maybe the breaking point will be that earthquake. Like maybe when people really don't have homes and jobs, they'll just be like, all right, like let's just go sleep on the rail tracks. You know, like I don't know what's going to break people loose of the spell of capitalism, and I can't wait for it, and we can't wait for it, so we have to keep organizing, but I don't know, I guess I just hope that, like, you know, when reality cracks and the floodgates open and all anyone wants to do is resist, that we're prepared and we know each other and we trust each other enough to make something happen.